Virginia Woolf's ideas about the opportunities and challenges facing women who wish to participate in public life or a life of letters in her own period are set out most fully in the two works of non-fiction I have placed on the screen. A Room of One's Own from 1929 and 3 Guineas published in 1938. A guinea, incidentally, was a value of money at the time. It was a coin. Now, both of these works are short books in their own right, but they evolved out of a series of speeches she gave to women's societies, to higher education, colleges for girls, and so on. So they very much have the character of a talk, but it also means they were sort of collated. They reflect her ideas built up over a period of time. Both of them address a specific issue facing women at the time. A Room of One's Own asks the question, what does a woman need to become a writer? And the second one, 3 Guineas, is set up as a response to a letter she received from a man asking her how she thought women could help prevent the impending war. As you can see, it was being written in the years leading up to the Second World War. War seemed increasingly inevitable, and the question then facing Virginia Woolf, whether it really was someone else's or her own, was what part can women play in this? What can women do to avert war? Because not least, for her, she did actually associate militarism, war, as a very male activity. Anyhow, to start with A Room of One's Own, this began life as a series of talks to members of girls' colleges at Cambridge University. And the way this starts out is by her saying, well, you've asked me to speak about women and literature. Now, the more I thought about this, the more I realised this is both an extremely large topic, potentially, and it's also a little bit vague. So it's not something I can manage in a talk of this kind. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer you my opinion on what a woman needs in order to be a writer. As you can see on the screen, she says, all I could do was to offer you an opinion upon one minor point. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. So the whole of the rest of the book is really Virginia Woolf telling us how she came to this conclusion, why she thinks a woman must have these two material needs satisfied if she is to be a creative writer. And she starts off, and really what the book does is show all the obstacles, all the disadvantages that women face compared with men at the start of the 20th century in trying to build a literary career. Now, as I said, she was giving this talk in Cambridge, and the word that she uses, and we tend to use whenever we talk about Oxford and Cambridge as a collective, is we use the word Oxbridge. It's a combination of the two. And she tells the story of how she was wandering around one of the colleges in Oxbridge, one of the nice old colleges, the centres of learning, and how many obstacles she encounters as a woman. She decides that she would like to go and see an important manuscript in one of the libraries. So she walks up to the door of the library and her way is blocked. She's not allowed in. She would only be allowed in if she was accompanied by a male who was a member of the college. So this symbolises barriers to the access to education. Now, after that, she then goes to visit someone in a women's college, and she observes just how little money, how few facilities this college has in comparison with men's colleges. So again, it exemplifies women have this learning barrier. It's hard even to find out the things you need to know. You don't have so much access. And one of her more general points is that throughout history, women have tended to be confined to quite small spaces, areas, usually the home, whereas the man is left free to wander over the whole globe and thus build up all kinds of experiences. So that's the first part of A Room of One's Own, showing that women don't have the same access to education. But what happens next is that she then, in the next chapter, she goes to visit the British Museum, which has a famous large library, and she thinks, okay, I've been asked to talk about women and fiction, I'll go to this great library and it will tell me everything I need to know. So she goes there, but to her shock and disappointment, there are more books on women than she could possibly have dreamt of. She comes to the conclusion that there can be no species on Earth that has been more studied or written about than woman. But of course, almost all of these books are by men of varying qualifications, or rather, as she implies, lack of qualifications. And what most of these books focus upon are women's limitations. Now, she tends to make up the titles of some books, but they're not wholly unrealistic, and she refers at times to one called, for example, The Mental, Moral and Physical Inferiority of Women to Men. So again, this exemplifies everything that a woman is up against, this idea that this whole culture has built up, that they are incapable of sufficient rational and intellectual thought and activity. So, as you can imagine, she's feeling rather discouraged by this point. She has a lecture to write and give, but she can't find any material. Her access to it is limited, and what material she finds is just so negative that it doesn't really get her anyway. So she goes home and she starts looking at her own collection of books, and she thinks, well, why is it that before the 19th century there were very, very few women writers? Those you get they tend to be baronesses, lady something or other, but only written as a sort of hobby in a way. So there's not really much evidence of women's writing, and she thinks, well, in particular, if we look at the Elizabethan period in English literature, which is the end of the 16th century, the start of the 17th, it's when the sonnets were being written by the likes of Philip Sidney, it's when Shakespeare was in his prime, Christopher Marlowe, Webster, John Donne, really the period that's often seen as the golden age of English literature. She says, why is it when there was this huge flourishing of literature, it was all by men, why weren't there any women writers? So Virginia Woolf creates the figure, the now very celebrated figure, of Shakespeare's sister. And Virginia Woolf asks, what would have happened to her if Shakespeare had had a sister who was every bit as talented as him? And she says, well, basically nothing would have happened for her, because first of all, unlike her brother, she would not have been allowed to go to school. Rather, she would have been expected to help with domestic tasks around the house. What's more, her parents would quite possibly have, at a very young age, identified a future husband for her, so she would be expected to get married. So Virginia Woolf, still thinking of Shakespeare's sister, thinks, no, but what if she resists all of this? What if she runs away to London? And she picks up this story that we don't really know what happened to Shakespeare when he first got to London, but she imagines that he sort of got his career up and running by holding horses at the door to the theatre, getting to know a few people, getting then a job as an actor, then starting to write, and so on and so forth. None of these things would have been possible for Shakespeare's sister. She would not have been employed to hold horses. She certainly would not have been allowed to act. No one would have, she wouldn't have been able to buy the paper to write on apart from anything else. She would have had no way of supporting herself. She probably would have been taken advantage of, in Virginia Woolf's imagination, by the agent of the company, impregnated, and then taken her own life and died unknown, with not a word of hers passed down to posterity. It's a very powerful story, this, and again illustrates how the reason there aren't women from this period, famous women writers from this period, is not because they weren't clever enough or didn't have the talents, but every obstacle would have been placed in their way. So then she comes forward to the 19th century, which is in English literature when you do have some undoubtedly great women novelists. Woolf actually speculates, why were they all novelists? Why not dramatic writers, poets and so on? But we'll leave that to one side for a moment. You may have heard of some of these famous names. There was Jane Austen. There were the Bronte sisters, Charlotte Bronte, who wrote Jane Eyre, for example, and Emily Bronte, who wrote Wuthering Heights, and then also Anne Bronte. Her works aren't quite so known now. And then there was a figure I mentioned in a previous video, George Eliot, really Mary Ann Evans. You know, these are all amongst the best novelists the English language has produced. All of them, they started off publishing their works either anonymously or using a male pseudonym. So Virginia Woolf asks, well, what is it that enables them to write, and to what extent can we see how conditions in society at the time affect their writings? And one observation she makes is that not one of them had children, and actually neither did she herself, and that point is not supposed to be lost on us. At least they were sort of spared some domestic tasks. They all lived fairly restricted and excluded lives. The Bronte sisters lived sort of out on this wild moor out in Yorkshire with their father, who is a priest. George Eliot, Virginia Woolf tells her story because it's quite terrible. She was spurned from society because she went to live with a man who still had a wife. The wife was still alive, but mentally she'd had this terrible illness. So George Eliot, or Mary Ann Evans, lived with this man, and society was scandalised, wouldn't have anything to do with her. Of course it was all right for him. He could carry on living his life as he would. And Virginia Woolf makes the point, well, on the one hand you've got George Eliot shut away in this cottage where no one will ever visit her, at least she's got time to write, everyone condemning her, and then you have these great European writers like the Russian Tolstoy, who's going round the continent impregnating people left, right and centre, and then writing novels partly based on his experience of the wider world, like War and Peace, which everyone then celebrates. But in any case, so these are all women who had some time on their hands. They didn't have children to look after. They had some kind of space where they could write their works, but it was always a communal space. A woman didn't have her own room, as I'll come back to. And their experience of life was limited as well. Jane Austen would write her works in her sitting room. They were sort of based on conversations she had with people who came to visit her, but nothing sort of outside as that. So it's really based on this quick survey that Woolf does of women's literary history in the English language that she comes to the conclusion that what a woman needs in order to be a writer is a room of her own and a sufficient amount of money. Without that you end up like Shakespeare's sister. So the room is important because it gives you a place, it gives you a little bit of independence. But she also stresses the importance of money. One of the reasons this is important, she thinks, is because it was only recently that women had been allowed to keep the money they earned. Previously, until about 1870, married women had to hand any money they earned over to their husbands. And Virginia Woolf sort of said, well, you know, if you want to be a writer and earn money, that's a bit of a disincentive if you don't get to have any of it anyway. And if you have your own money, then you can be a little bit more independent. And this is the point we've already seen her make in her talk, Professions for Women, where she talks about fighting the angel in the house, this voice that tells her she has to be subservient to a man. She has to comply to a man's wishes. Whatever she writes has to be pleasing to a man. And Virginia Woolf there in that speech says, you know, what enabled me to fight her was that I was given a small inheritance of a bit of money, so I was no longer dependent on another person, so I could express my own views and do my own thing. So these are why she says you need to have money of your own and you need to have a room of your own. preferably with a lock on the door. And of course many men, at least of a certain class, had always had their study, somewhere they could retire and think their own thoughts and do their own things, away from the hustle and the bustle of the rest of the family. So Virginia Woolf says you need these two things, and they actually stand for something important. As you can see from the quotation I've placed here, that 500 a year stands for the power to contemplate. That lock on the door means the power to think for yourself. So this is very, very fundamental. And she goes on to make a very important point, that then we all like to think of intellectual freedom as something that's intangible. We can't touch it, we can't grasp it. It's something very elevated and high. But Virginia Woolf is quite insistent that material things make this possible. As she says here, intellectual freedom depends on material things. Poetry depends upon intellectual freedom. And this emphasis on the material needs, material things, is very important for Virginia Woolf's thinking about gender, about women and about men and about the relationships between them. And this is why in all her novels, as well as her books about women's situation, she often presents the situation in very, very spatial terms. She uses the landscape of houses, of rooms, of doors, windows, rooms and so on. You usually get the man moving around in these open spaces, whereas the woman is confined, often inside in some ways. Her novel Mrs. Dalloway, which I'll come back to shortly, it's set after the First World War, at the time when it looks like things are opening up for women. It looks as if the barriers that have stopped them living fulfilling equal lives before are potentially being lifted. So it's very much a threshold moment. Are these opportunities real? Are women going to take advantage of them? And she expresses this by often having her characters standing near doorways or besides windows. This sense of a place that could be opening up. You can look out a window, you can go through a door, but at the same time doors can also be closed, or windows consist of glass. We have to open them before we go through them. We've all heard the phrase a glass ceiling applied to women in the workplace, amongst other places. But anyway, Virginia Woolf is very important in helping establish this notion of representing women's experience in terms of space, in terms of localities and rooms. Now I'll come back to Mrs. Dalloway a little bit later, but as I said at the start, what's interesting about Virginia Woolf historically is that she's writing at this period of considerable change. She can look back to how things were. She can see that things are changing for women in her society, but the consequences haven't yet revealed themselves, or whether these are real opportunities or not. And so she tries to express what she hopes is going to happen in the future of women's writing. And she observes in A Room of One's Own that suddenly, there have been centuries with very little written by women, suddenly in recent decades there are a lot more things being written by women. And what she's happy about is it's not just fiction, or it's not just poetry, but it's travel books, it's books on science, it's books on all the range of things that a man has been free to write for a very long time. And so Virginia Woolf, in A Room of One's Own, she also tries to survey her own contemporary period and the kind of writing women are doing, and she feels that inevitably there's still too much a focus on the part of the woman writer on women. Or to put this another way, women's experience has been so restricted for so long that women's experience of the world, what they can write about, remains to a degree limited as well, that the women are held back as writers by gender, and sometimes they let this come through as frustration with the male world in their writing. And Virginia Woolf tends to see this as a little bit of a defect, and she looks forward to a time when she says that Well, she hopes that women will be able to write like the best of the male writers, like Shakespeare, having forgotten their own gender, having transcended it. And she picks up on the idea of what she calls the androgynous mind, the mind that is neither masculine nor feminine, but a kind of blending of them both, something that incorporates everything. So at this period of time, 1929, that's what her position is. But it does seem that she changed her mind, or at least shifted her position in the decade that intervened before she came to publish 3 Guineas.